Yeah,
Yes.
continue. Okay. So, welcome to the third lecture on approaching astrophysics, guys. So, this lecture is all about astronomical techniques and basic principles of physics in astronomy. So, first, I'll be doing the first part, that is the astronomical techniques. So, next slide, please. So the structure of this lecture would be first we'll see the basic optical definitions in astronomy. That is magnification, what is the light gathering power, and dissolving power and diffraction limit. So next would be the different types of telescopes and their mountings and what are space telescopes. And the last part we'll see what are detectors and how we use it with telescopes. So next slide. So yeah, so we all know that telescope is a very important thing that we use in astronomy, and the telescope is most common thing we know. Okay, so most of people think that a telescope only is kind of a magnifying power, but however, magnification is only one of the three powers of a telescope. The other two being the resolving power and the light gathering power. Before we describe the various telescopes, first let us discuss these concepts as applicable in astronomy. Next slide. So first one would be magnification, and from optics we know that magnifying power of a telescope refers to its ability to make the image appear bigger. So if the angle subtended, so in the figure, if you see the angle, the subtended by the distance object at the objective of the telescope, let it be something like beta, and the angle subtended by the virtual image at the eye is alpha. Okay, next slide. So these angles being defined, we define something called as the angular magnification, and that would be the ratio between these angles, that is the alpha and beta. So for calculation purposes, we can also take it as from trigonometry. We can convert it the alpha and beta to be f naught by fe, where f naught and fe being the focal length of the eyepiece and the focal length of the telescope. So, for example, if a telescope has an objective with focal length 60 centimeters and eyepiece focal length is zero point 0.5 centimeters, its angular magnification. Okay, sorry. So, yeah, for example, if we consider the telescope with focal length being 60 centimeters and the eyepiece focal length being zero point 0.5 centimeters, and angular magnification, that is AM, will be defined to be 60 upon zero point 0.5, and that would be 120 times. So this is what we call as 120 times magnification of the light that we see. Next slide, please. So the next definition would be the light gathering power. And the light gathering power of a telescope refers to its ability to collect the light from an object. So interestingly, celestial objects mostly have faint sources of light because they are very far away. And in order to get the image that we need to capture as much as possible from them, we need to get more of what's available. So this is somewhat similar to catching rainwater in a bucket, which we were doing in our childhood. That is, and we know that more we could capture more rainwater if when the area of the vessel or whatever or bucket will be more. So similarly, the light gathering power of telescope is directly proportional to the area of the telescope objective. Okay, so it is proportional to the diameter. So the area is pi r square, that is pi into d by 2 square. So 2 is a constant. So the ratio of the light gathering power of two telescopes can be defined as d1 by d2 the whole square. Okay. So again, for example, if a telescope has diameter 100 mm, so the light gathering power would be 156.25 times more than a human eye, with reference to the human eye, which typically has a pupil diameter of 8 mm. Next slide. So the ability of a telescope to reveal the fine detail of an object is determined by its something called the resolving power. So the resolving power, if we see, so we have done many experiments in our lab also. So we would have done the diffraction, and we have seen that we adjust the focal length, right? So when we adjust the focal length at a point, it is very bright, and moving away right to the right or to the left, it becomes very shady and very blurry. Okay, so we might have observed, and if it is not, I mean, the point image will be not sharp, so the blurry thing that we get is called the airy disk. Okay, so the disk is surrounded by a number of alternate bright and dark fringes which are produced due to a phenomenon called diffraction, which we know from optics. So the central bright disk represents the image of the object where it is situated. So now suppose we wish to observe two close stars that appear equally bright. Close stars in the sense they're not really close, but apparently from our point of view, they appear to be close. So when we want to observe two close stars, we should be able to observe two airy disks of corresponding stars. So however, whether we see them as distant disks or overlapping with each other depends on the resolving power of the telescope. In the next slide, I've given some figures where I've shown like three diagrams. So first, let us look something called the Rayleigh criterion that is used to resolve the air disk. So two equally bright stars are said to be resolved when the central maximum of one diffraction pattern coincides with the minimum of the other. So we get a really clear image. Next slide. Yeah, so here we see the three figures. So first one is when the stars are easily resolved. The second is the stars are just resolved. And the third one would be stars are too close and not resolved. So in the first, we can see that they are distinct. Okay, the overlapping air days are very distinct, and we can differentiate those. But in the second one, they are comparatively less distinct. So here it has just resolved, and the third being very blurry, and that is we can't even differentiate the two different star air disks of the different stars. So the next one, yeah. So no. Go to the previous slide. Yeah. So we might as well ask what are the factors determining the telescope's resolving power, right? So the factors would be the first one would be the quality of the lenses that we use. That is a major factor upon all. But even if we use the perfect optics, the resolving power of a telescope should be limited with something called the phenomenon of diffraction. So this limit, which we define as calculated by and is given by R, that is the diffraction limit of resolution, and it is equal to 1.22 lambda divided by D. So this is the formula for calculating diffraction limit of resolution. So the smaller the value of R, the better is the instrument's ability to resolve the nearby objects. Next slide. So next we come to the optical telescopes, and telescopes of out of the curiosity of the mankind, telescopes were invented way before, and telescopes have undergone tremendous changes or evolution from Galileo's times when only refracting telescopes are used. The nowadays the most recent telescopes have mirrors that can actively be shaped according to the observer's need. So the refracting telescopes, which are used in the olden days, became outdated very soon because of the three factors which I've listed here. The first is that it was difficult to make good large lenses required for large light gathering area. Second is that large lenses was very heavy and balancing the telescope became very difficult. So they were not able to uh, mount it. So the third one is that the lenses suffered from optical aberrations. So the errors in the telescope was visible then. So next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the first one is the reflecting telescopes, and reflecting telescopes with mirror have been around us like more than a century. And in the last few decades, advanced technologies have been developed, which allow the observer to uh, make it as per our need, and we can modify them. Such active and adaptive optics have completely changed the basic tool of observational astronomy, and it is very modern now. So we describe the various types of telescopes. So now let's see the types of reflecting telescopes. So the first one that was made by James Gregory of Scotland. He proposed the first design for reflecting telescopes in which he used a paraboloidal mirror as the objective, that is the primary mirror, that is, and this purpose was to minimize the chromatic and spherical errors or aberrations. So here you can see the diagram, the ray diagram of the telescope given by Gregory. So next slide. So in this telescope, the light from distant object hits the primary mirror first, and it is reflected to the secondary mirror, which reflects it again down to the telescope tube going to the secondary focus. So thus the light emerges from the telescope through small central hole in the primary mirror, and it is observed with an eyepiece or the detector. In our case, that is the. So the performance of Gregorian telescope was not very satisfactory, and again Newton was there to modify it. And the Newton telescope, which was kind of a modernization of the previous one, uses a parabolic primary, same as the previous one, but here he used a flat mirror as a secondary, which is set at a particular angle, that is 45 degrees to the axis of the tube. Okay. The light is brought to a focus at the side of the telescope where the eyepiece is placed. So in these days, the system is widely used even now. Even now, I think we use this telescope. So next slide. So a little later, okay. So French optician, Cassegrain, if I'm right in pronouncing. So who lived at the time of Newton, he designed another reflector. This you can see here the ray diagram of that. And nowadays, the most commonly used telescope is this one, and it has a central hole in the primary mirror, which allows the light to come out of for placing a eyepiece and other general detector or instrument. So next slide. So next, let us see what are the different types of telescope mounting. Okay, so most of the small telescopes, okay, that is less than 1 meter diameter, uses the equatorial mounting. Okay, in an equatorial mounting, the base on which the telescope is mounted is set. It's set so that the axis points to the North Pole always. So this is done by raising the axis by an angle equal to the latitude at the place. So whichever place we are used for measuring, we should measure that. I mean, we should take into account the latitude angle and place at that angle. So this axis is called the polar axis, and rotation about the polar axis is used for adjustment in the right ascension. So the telescope is also provided with the motion about an axis perpendicular to the polar axis called the declination axis for adjustment and declination. Thus, a combination of these two motions will allow the telescope to point at any object whose equatorial coordinates are known. Equatorial coordinates. This equatorial mounting got its name from because it is in order with the equatorial coordinates, which we have discussed in the last lecture, I think. So here, the diagram of equatorial mounting is shown. This is the angle that is equal to the latitude at the place where we are measuring. So next slide. So the second type of mounting is the azimuthal mounting, and all modern telescopes today, that is more than 2 meter of diameter, use our altitude azimuthal type mounting. And major limitation of this is that the altitudes of and azimuths of the objects change with the location of the observer with time for the same observer because of the rotation of the Earth. So we are using all modern telescopes today are using this, and yeah, next one. So the next one is the space telescopes. The major need that we have why we went to the space telescopes is that if we are observing it on the Earth, okay, Earth has an atmosphere with different gases, and the observation of the light may be limited because of the absorption and radiation of different gases. So, if we go to the space, there will be no disturbance as of the atmospheric gases. So, we send the telescope to the space to get a modernized observations. So, for light collection, one could fabricate these telescope of increasing the large diameters, but these are limited by the fact of Earth's atmosphere. So this will overcome the limitation. So if we put a telescope in space, then the Earth's atmosphere would not be limiting the factor, and we could achieve diffraction limited images. So here, the photo that is shown is of the Hubble Space Telescope, that is most famous telescope, I can say. Yeah, next slide. So an important this one is of the telescope to be learned is there are two different types of kind of telescope, that are the active and adaptive telescopes. Okay, so in active telescope, the shape of the primary mirror can be changed according to the observation needs, and this is done with the help of pistons placed at the back of the mirror support. Okay, this is called active telescopes. And adaptive telescopes, in adaptive telescope, the changes in the shape of the primary mirror are done controlled so that according to the observer's need. Okay, so that upon change in the Earth's atmosphere during night. Okay, in some sense, the adaptive telescopes can beat the effect of the atmosphere, but not to the extent of space telescopes, because space telescope we are totally going to the space and observing, so there will be no limiting factor due to the atmosphere of Earth. Here also there will definitely be a little bit of the limiting of by Earth's atmosphere. Next slide. So the next topic would be detectors and their use with telescopes. Okay, so detectors are used for measuring light output from a telescope and play a very major role in obtaining information about stars, galaxies, etc. The actual light available from the astronomical object, as I before said, that it is very small, as it is very small because we are very far from them. Okay, and detectors are used with telescopes in the following two modes of operation, and they are imaging and photometry. So imaging involves taking direct pictures of the star fields and extended objects like gas, clouds, and galaxies. Since sharp images are required for us over a wide field, which may extend up to the several square degrees. Okay. Careful optical design is a natural requirement for this type of mode of operation in telescopes or detectors. So second one would be the photometry, and this involves measuring total brightness or spectrum, etc., of an object. Okay. So compared to the imaging mode, poorer images are acceptable in this case. But the stellar image has to be small enough to enter an aperture or the slit available in the spectrograph. So next slide. So here we briefly see the types of the detectors, and detectors used in imaging mode are mainly two-dimensional, okay, 2D type, since we are trying to form images of objects in a given area. Okay. Examples of such detectors are charge photographic emulsion. Human eye is a very good example, and charge coupled devices (CCD) as we popularly know it as. Okay, so detectors used for photometry of single objects are 1D, since they receive photons from object only. So there is no need to go to the different dimensions. So the photometer is a 1D detector. Next slide. So photometer. Before the advent of CCD, that is the charge coupled devices, the measurement of high intensity light and color were made using a photometer, which is a very highly sensitive light meter attached to a telescope. A photometer is still being used in photometry of single stars. It is used more commonly for stars whose light output varies with time, which is not a constant. Okay, such variable stars. The most important component of a photometer is photomultiplier tube, that is based on the photoelectric effect, which we very well know. And the last one would be the charge coupled devices. It contains a very large number of microscopic light detectors arranged in an order or an array. So they detect both bright and faint object in a single exposure, and brightness and color can be measured to very high precision using CCDs. Next slide. So we have a detector, so we should define something called the efficiency of a detector. So how well we can measure the intensity or other factors of light. So it is defined on the basis of quantum efficiency. I'm not going very deep on how it is calculated and all, but so quantum efficiency is defined to be the ratio of number of photons actually detected divided by the number of photons recorded by the ideal or perfect detector. So it is always less than 1, because it will not be more or equal to the photons detected by an ideal detector. So the quantum efficiency of various detectors in terms of wavelength is shown in the figure. So you can see for an eye it is very small, and photograph and photo multiplier tube, all this. Next slide. Yeah, so that's it from my part. Now I hand it over to Achu to take over the basic principles used in astrophysics. Thank you.
Yeah, Achit, you can go ahead.
Am I audible? No, my voice.
Yeah, now you're audible. Yeah.
So, hey guys, welcome back. For my part will include the physical principles which are involved in astrophysics. So now, like in previous lectures, also we have studied about various coordinate systems and astronomical instruments and techniques that we need and we use in order to observe various astronomical bodies. So now the other another step is to analyze the properties of those astronomical bodies, and for that one of the major concern is like gravitation. As we all know, gravitation is an attractive force. So the basic question that arises is like, if it's an attractive force, why does our systems or galaxies or clusters do not shrink in size? Secondly, like, astronomy or astrophysics is a science in which we do experiments virtually. Like, we cannot do experiments like in a laboratory, so we need certain certain concepts like thermal physics and all, through which we can study their properties by analyzing the radiations coming out from it. So yes, we will discuss those in details. Next slide. Like in our basic physics courses also we have studied like major long range forces are electromagnetic and gravitational. Okay, so the case with electromagnetic is like, if we consider like there are two charged bodies like positive and negative, and if they are not in relative motion with each other, so the won't move, like the magnitude of that electromagnetic force will be zero. So the only long range force that is left is gravitational, and we all know that it is always attractive. So the thing, like I earlier said, like, if it is attractive, then all of our galaxies such as stars and all, they should shrink in size, but that doesn't seem to happen. So for that we will try to explain it with the help of virial theorem, so in Newtonian mechanical way. Okay, so we let m and m, big and small m, be the masses of sun and a planet in a solar system. So like, for simplicity, if we assume that planet is orbiting in a circular orbit, okay, with the radius r and speed v, then the force, centripetal force and the gravitation force, both will be equal. So we can write all the this as 2 mv square by 2 minus gmm by r. Like, we will multiply and divide by these equation by 2. So from this, the gravitation potential energy of sun and planet is minus gmm by r, whereas the kinetic energy is ek is equal to half mv square. So when we put all these values in this, what do we get is 2 ek plus eg is equal to 0. So this is real theorem for a planet going around the sun. So now now we ponder, like, what is the significance of this result. Okay, so this says that the whatever the kinetic energy, whatever the velocity with which the stars and galaxies are moving, they are balanced by an equal amount of potential energy. So this is the main reason, like, why they are not shrinking in size, because they are balanced by their own gravitational potential energy. So, like, as we all know, like, our Milky Way galaxy is a spiral galaxy, but there are also other galaxies which have circular orbits. So, like, there are clusters and elliptical galaxies. So they move randomly. So due to these random motions, the star do not fall to the center due to gravitation. So like we get puzzled by this, like why, how could this be happen? So we will take a simple example. So like we are surrounded by air molecules, okay? So air molecules and dust particles or whatever, so the gravity is also acting on them, but we don't see the molecules or atoms coming down to the earth and resting on its surface, no. So this is the reason, like they are on balanced by their own gravitation potential energy, right?
Achut, your voice got cut off.
Hello.
Yeah, now you're on.
Did it cut off like now
Yeah.
only?
I mean, like, only like a for 2 seconds it got cut off. Like,
Yeah, next slide. So one of the major significance of virial theorem is determination of dark matter. Next slide. So like in 1930s, Fritz Zwicky was an astronomer in Caltech. So he was studying the clusters and observing the motion and all of those clusters. So okay, what he could compare the masses by two ways: by analyzing the motion, and second by luminosity and mass relationship. So as we all know, the time a galaxy needs to travel through a cluster is much smaller than the age of the world. So we can assume that they are relatively bound systems. So we can use theorem over here for a cluster galaxies, that is kinetic energy is 1 by minus 1 by 2 or times the potential energy. Next slide. So now what he did was the kinetic energy, the total kinetic energy becomes half m3v, where this is the average velocity, and the elevation energy, that is the potential energy, is minus gm by square. So when we put all these values, we can get an estimate mass of a cluster of a galaxy. Okay. So now when we insert the data of comma cluster in above equation, like what is the mass is 10 raised to power 15 solar masses, and total luminosity is 10 raised to power 13 solar luminosity. So what he found when he took the ratio of the mass and the luminosity, that was 100 times more than original mass. So he came up with two conclusions. First, like there is a defect in Newtonian Einstein's theories, like of gravitation. Secondly, like there is certain amount of matter that we cannot see, but that is affecting the motion of the galaxies and cluster, and he termed that as dark matter. So that is how we came to know what there is something called known as dark matter. Next slide. So how this like dark matter affect the rotation curve of galaxies? So from the equation mv square by r is equal to gm m by r square, get the value for the velocity, that v square is equal to gm by r. So now this proves that like if the more the mass, then more will be the velocity, and object has the more the gravitation pull it should have. So now what happens, like as we all know, like our universe is expanding, like okay. So at comparatively at the center, if we go to the edges, so there will be less mass. So according to that, there should be less gravitational pull, and they should like shrink in size, as we see in the graph for like first two lines, like disk and hollow, like they are decreasing. But what is the actual rotation curve is like dotted all these things. So as you know, it goes constant. So why this goes constant? Like even at the edge of the galaxy, there is some mass, undetermined mass, or some mass which is affecting the rotation of the galaxies. So this is how virial theorem, give us an idea, a theory about the presence of dark matter. Next slide. So now, what we come is Newton versus Einstein, the basic, rivalry in physics. So like Einstein's general relativity, we usually use it in determining the black holes. And we all know like black holes are nothing but strong certain objects like which have so much large gravitational field that even light cannot pass. But in Newton's theory of gravitation, like there is no mention about like effect of gravitation on light. So now now we will try to explain the effect of gravity on light through Newtonian theory. Okay, next slide. What we'll consider is like a mass, sun, like a body of mass m, and another body of mass small m, like sun or a planet, we could say. So for that, we know the potential energy is gonna be minus gmm by r. So if we use non-relativistic expression for kinetic theory, so like we will use non-relativistic because we are going with according to Newton. So that would be the total energy of a system would be half mc square minus gmm by r. The Newtonian theory tells us that the particle will escape from the gravitational field E. Gravitational field if E is positive, and it will get trapped if E is negative. In other words, one half of my mc square minus gmm by r less than 0. Okay. If it is less than 0, then we get the condition of trapping. So, and also it turns out that these are more accurate calculations. We get these we get this result only, but with more accuracy through general relativity also for light trapping and all. Slide. No. Thermodynamic thermodynamic equilibrium. So various physics principles we can apply to it. So first we will try to recapitulate those principles, and we can try to find out like what is their significance and whether could they be applied in our astrophysical systems or not. Next. So the first is Maxwellian velocity distribution. So now according to Maxwell, we take a container, and there's a gas filled with the container. So what Maxwell told us that every gas particle is moving with different velocity in that container. So the major more important thing is it should be in thermodynamic equilibrium. So if we take a gas uh, at temperature T, and number of particles per unit volume have speeds between v and v plus dv. So the number of particles is given by this formula 4 pi n by m upon 2 pi kbt raised to power 3 by 2 v square exponential of minus mv square by 2 kbt dv, where kb is Boltzmann constant, okay, and n is the number of particles per unit volume, and m is the mass of each particle. Next. That like we have studied in like modern physics on, like we will study like a that hydrogen atom has several different energy levels. So it is possible to break the hydrogen atom into proton and electron also. So that process we called ionization. If hydrogen atoms are in a container and in a thermodynamic equilibrium, then we can find out the fraction of atoms that will get excited and that will remain in their ground state. So if n naught is the number density of atoms in ground state, then the number density of the atoms at that Ne in excited state with energy above ground state is given by the expression this, that Ne divided by No is directly proportional to exponential of minus e k by t. So this is also popularly known as Boltzmann distribution law. So now, and what could we say? Following this, we have Saha equation. Next, in 1919, Indian physicist M.S. Saha, he derived an equation which tells us what fraction of gas will be ionized at a certain temperature T and pressure P. So we assume is if N1 is the number of hydrogen atoms out of which N2 are ionized at temperature T, then the Saha equation, we get this Saha equation, where I is the ionization potential of hydrogen, P is the partial pressure on the electrons that they, you know, put on each other, and H is Planck's constant, and M is the mass of light. And the, you know, a convenient form of this equation is this: log of N2 PE divided by N1 is equal to 2.5 log of temperature minus 50 by T I minus 0.48. Next slide. Another like is black body radiation and Planck's law. So we know that when radiation is in thermodynamic with matter in thermodynamic equilibrium, it is called black body radiation. So the spectral distribution of energy in black body radiation is given by a famous law derived by Planck in 1900. So the energy density UV dV lying in frequency range between V and V plus dV is given by this. So this is famous law, gives us the radiation emitted. So we can use it in like various astrophysical systems also, like galaxies and stars, like how they radiate their light and all radiation. So next slide. Now we know that matter can both emit and absorb radiation. Okay. So now we will study the processes of emission and absorption by matter. We will by introducing suitable coefficients of emission and absorption. So as I have mentioned here, radiative transfer is the name of the subject or study in which we study the interaction of radiation with matter having prescribed emission and absorption coefficients. So now first we will try to visualize and see the mathematical description of a radiation at a given point in space. Like we'll try to find the equation for a radiation at a point. Next slide. For that, what we will consider? We will consider a small area dA, and we will and the radiation that is striking on it. Okay, so now we will let DeV dV be the energy of radiation passing through the area in that time dt, small time dt, and from the solid angle d omega centered at theta and lying in the frequency range V plus dV. So the energy dEVD is proportional to the area dA cos theta projected perpendicular. So it will be perpendicular to each other. At that point, the radiation that we'll get is dE dV is equal to IV function of R, T and N cap cos theta dA dt d omega dV. So where N cap is the unit vector and it denotes the direction from which radiation is coming. And capital N cap is the unit vector normal to the area dA. So now that this is the quantity IV, which is a function of R that I position, time and unit vector is called specific intensity. And as we can see, like it is a function of position, time and R. Next slide. If this IV is specified for all directions at every point of a region at a time, then we said that the radiation field in that region is completely specified. Next slide. Now that we have known like the specific intensity at a point, so now through that we could measure various quantities like radiation flux or energy density, that a number of radiations passing through that area in a given time. So like for a radiation flux, it will be simply total energy of radiation coming from all directions at that particular point per area per unit time. So what we do, we simply divide that area by dA by dt, the previous equation, and then we get the radiation flux with the frequency V is given by FV is IV cos theta d omega. Sorry. So the total radiation flux will be given by F is equal to FV dV, simply integrating it with the limit. Right. The next thing is momentum, like momentum flux. Now as we have mentioned, the pressure of the radiation field over a surface is given by the momentum exchanged area per unit time, or momentum flux we can say, perpendicular to that surface. Let us obtain an expression for momentum flux. Now we know that the momentum associated with the photon of energy DeV is DeV by c, that is speed, where c is speed of light. So its component normal to the surface d is cos theta c, as we have mentioned, like the area dA and the cos theta is perpendicular to each other. So on dividing this dA dt, we get momentum flux, which is equal to dEV cos theta by c dA dt. Derive momentum flux in terms of specific intensity, which is dEV cos theta by c 1 by dA dt is equal to IVC cos square theta d omega. So from this we can derive the radiation pressure PV is given by integrating the momentum flux all over the directions. So, the radiation field, what we is isotropic, it does not change. So that it is independent of theta and phi. It won't be, depend upon the angle of particular angle from where it is coming and going. So then d omega will be sine theta d phi, and that integration is equal to 4 pi. Hence we get the radiation pressure to be c cos square theta d omega is equal to 4 pi IV by c. Next slide. So now the major thing in like astrophysics is like we need to understand the interaction of matter and radiation in order to explain the spectra of objects like stars or galaxies. So for that we should discuss the effect of matter on radiation field. So like if matter is present, if we assume if matter is present, then the specific intensity of the radiation field keeps changing as we move along a ray of path. So before considering that, we will determine what happens to the specific intensity in an empty space when we move along a path. Like we'll assume that there is no matter. So for that, as we have in the figure also, we have two areas dA1 and dA2 separated by distance r and perpendicular to ray of light. Let IV1 and IV2 be the specific intensities of radiation in the direction of ray path at dA1 and dA2. So as we have derived earlier the specific intensity at a point, so that will at dA1 it will be IV dA2 dt d omega 2 dV. So and that is equal to the same radiation they will emit, no? So that will be equal to radiation emitted by 2, that is IV dA1 dt d omega 1 dV. Next slide. Where d omega 1 is the solid angle subtended by dA2 at dA1. So when we equate these two expressions, we note that the specific intensities are equal to each other. So in other words, what we can say, in empty space, the specific intensity along a ray path does not change. If S is the distance measured along the ray of path, then that is equal to 0 because it won't change with the distance. Like now the queer thing or like strange thing about this result is like, we know intensity falls off as we move further and further away from a source of radiation. So how the specific intensity here could be constant as we are moving? Okay, so this can be cleared when we keep in mind that this specific intensity is due to a source. Actually, it's intensity divided by the solid angle, its substance. So, and that we call surface brightness of an object. Okay, so like this means that the specific intensity is a measure of surface brightness. So as we move further away from the source of radiation, its intensity and angular size falls as distance square, like they are related to distance as distance square. So hence the surface brightness, which is the ratio of these two, does not change. So now we'll consider the specific intensity of two areas by considering when there is matter along the path. Next, if matter, we expect that it will add to the specific intensity, like if a matter emits like radiation, so it will add up to the specific intensity. So this can be taken care by adding an emission constant JV on the right hand side. On the other hand, absorption by matter would lead to a diminution, like reduce in total specific intensity, and that reduced rate or diminution rate must be proportional to the specific intensity itself. Like in other words, the stronger the beam, the more energy there is for absorption. Hence, the absorption term on the right hand side should be negative and proportional to IV. Thus, we obtain the radiative transfer equation gives the value of specific intensity in the presence of matter, which is div ds is equal to emission coefficient Jv minus alpha V IV. So now the radiative transfer equation provides the basis for an understanding of interaction between matter and radiation. It is fairly trivial to solve this equation if either the emission coefficient or the absorption coefficient is zero. So let us now we'll consider the cases like what if a matter does not emit radiation, like that JV is equal to 0, then the above equation will be minus alpha V IV. So, and when we integrate this over a path S naught to S, then we will get V is equal to IV function of S naught exponential minus integral of alpha V S dash ds. So now what we'll do, we'll discuss more general solutions of radiative transfer equations. Like now these solutions, what they will do, they will, like provide answers to the questions such as like, why is radiation emitted from nebula usually in spectral lines, or why do we see absorption lines in stellar spectra? So yeah, next slide. So term is optical depth, which comes from the solution of radiative transfer equation. So in order to obtain a general solution of this transfer equation, we need two quantities, optical depth and source function. So let us first define what is optical depth, and we denote it by tau v. So now optical depth will be a function of, like, it will be equal to alpha v ds, the absorption coefficient multiply the path. So the optical depth over the path S0 to S will be alpha v S dash ds dash. Now we are considering the case like the matter is not emitting radiation, that is JV is equal to 0. So the specific intensity along the ray path will fall as IV, and it will be a function of optical depth is equal to IV E raised to power minus tau V. Now based on the values of tau V, we can define objects as optically thick or optically thin. What are optically thick and optically thin objects? If the optical depth of a matter or something is like tau v is greater than 1 along a ray path through an object, then it is known as optically thick. And if an object is optically thin, like that, it will be very, very less than 1. Okay. Next slide. So now from the above equations, we can say that optically thick object that IV is equal to 0 extinguishes the light of a source behind it. So what about the optically thin object? For that we need to define the source function, like from where the light is emitting. So that will be equal to JV by alpha V. Dividing the radiative transfer equation by alpha V and using above equations, we get diV divided by d tau V is equal to minus IV plus SV. If we multiply these equations by e raised to power tau v, what we get is ddt tau v of iv e raised to power tau v is equal to sv e power tau v. Sorry. So now integrating this equation from optical path 0 to tau v, that is from S0 to S along ray path, we get general solution of a radiative transfer equation, which is this. Matter through the radiation is passing has constant properties. Then we can take SV, that is source function, to be constant. The integral would become this. Now, what we are interested in is like studying the emission and absorption properties of an object itself without a source behind it. So for that we have obtained the solution in the above equation, no? Like if we take source to be constant. So now we'll study how it affects the emission and absorption properties. So then if like there is no source, then we can take IV is equal to 0. Then the equation becomes is equal to SV into 1 minus e raised to power minus tau v. Slide. No, like for an optically thin object, tau v is very less than 1. So minus e raised to power minus tau v be maybe approximately 1 minus tau v. So then the equation will be IV is equal to JVL. Okay. Now, L is the total length of the ray path. Okay. And optically thick object, IV is equal to SV. As like E minus tau V will be greater than 1. So from those equations we get this. Yeah, next slide. So now like previous equations from we have derived true important results. Now to understand their physical significance, we will now look at the thermodynamic. We'll consider some thermodynamic considerations. So now suppose we have a box kept in a thermodynamic equilibrium and we make a small hole on its side. We know that the radiation that will be coming out will be black body radiation. And we know, like we have derived the specific intensity for black body radiation as BV is equal to 2h V cube by C square by potential of HV by KBT minus 1. So now the specific intensity of that radiation coming out of a hole is simply will be the function of this black body radiation. And this is for a special case when we have taken like in thermodynamic equilibrium. Now from the equation like the source function, we get famous Kirchhoff's law, like the coefficient of emission is equal to alpha V BVT. So now what is the significance of these equation? So what we can say is like the nature of radiation from an astrophysical source, it depends on whether the source is optically thick or thin. Radiation from a tenuous nebula is usually in spectral lines. On the other hand, as we have told, and of that the emission of stars is in almost like a black body. So now the question is why is it so? Now, as we know, like we have in previous equations, we assumed that the source to have constant properties, that SV we have taken it to 0. So like we know it won't be true for a star because as you go down inside the star surface, the temperature keeps on increasing. So it is the temperature gradient near the star surface which gives rise to absorption lines. Because of the change in temperature, we get absorption lines. Now, if we assume the thermodynamic equilibrium like we have derived in this equation, this function should be equal to the black body radiation, like that IV is equal to BVT. So, we really have strict thermodynamic equilibrium. Also, the temperature inside a star is not constant, but it varies with the radius. As you know, like outerwards temperature will be cool, and as you go towards the center of it, it increases. So in that So in that situation, will this equation IV is equal to BV hold or not? As we have seen in Maxwellian velocity distribution and Boltzmann law and Saha equation, like if we have taken a system in thermodynamic equilibrium, this generally means that temperatures does not vary much over it. For Planck's law to hold, the radiation has to interact with matter efficiently. So now for these things, we note that the radiative transfer equation, that alpha v absorption coefficient, has dimension inverse of its length. If we take the inverse of that absorption coefficient, it gives the distance over which significant part of a beam radiation would get absorbed by matter. To that part, we call it as mean free path of photons. So now the smaller the value of inverse of alpha v, the more efficient is interaction between matter. And alpha v is larger, okay, we can say the mean free path will be small, length over which temperature varies appreciably. Then all important laws of thermodynamic equilibrium hold. So such a situation is known as local thermodynamic equilibrium, which is abbreviated as LTE. And now inside a star, we expect to be very good approximation, and we can assume that IV is equal to BV to hold good when we solve radiative transfer equation inside.
Am I audible?
Hello.
Yeah, Achit, you're audible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm audible now.
Yeah.
So like I was explaining the significance of this local thermodynamic equilibrium, like what it was.
Achit, I can't hear you again.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
So now I was explaining, why like uh, why there is difference between, like, for a nebula we get spectral lines, and why, like, so as you go down to a star surface, the temperature keeps on increasing. So it is the temperature gradient near the star surface which gives rise to the absorption lines. So now if we assume the thermodynamic equilibrium we have derived in the equation, like IV is equal to BV, so that the source function should be equal to the black body function, like IV is equal to BV, or SV is equal to BV. Okay? So in a realistic situation, if we consider, we really have strict thermodynamic equilibrium. So the temperature inside a star is not constant, but and it varies with its radius. So we have already seen those equations: Maxwellian velocity, Boltzmann and Saha equation, so which they hold when system is in thermodynamic equilibrium. So this generally means that the temperature does not vary much over it. And for, if we want our Planck's law also to hold good, then the radiation has to interact with the matter efficiently. Okay, so now the from the equation, like we have mentioned before, uh, alpha v has the dimension of inverse of its length. So its inverse, alpha v inverse, gives the distance over which a significant part of a beam of radiation would get absorbed by the matter. So we generally define this distance, like alpha inverse v, as mean free path of photons. So this, since this is the typical distance a photon is expected to traverse freely before interacting with the n atom. So the smaller the alpha v inverse, the more efficient is the interaction between matter and radiation. And like if it is sufficiently small such that the temperature can be taken as taken as constant over such distances, then we expect Planck's law to hold good. So in other words, if both alpha v inverse and mean free path of particles are small compared to length over which temperature varies, then all important laws will hold good of, like, thermodynamic equilibrium. So now to this situation, such situation, we call it as local thermodynamic equilibrium, or LTE. So yeah, inside a star we expect LTE to be very good approximation, and we can assume that IV is equal to BVT. So to hold, when we solve a radiative transfer equation inside the star, now in the outer atmosphere of star, LTE may fail, and it may often becomes necessary to consider departures from LTE when studying the transfer of radiation there. So now the next thing is we'll talk about local thermodynamic equilibrium. So now we'll consider like a box kept in a thermodynamic equilibrium. So now if you make a small hole on its side. So we know that the radiation that would be coming out from that hole would be a black body radiation. And previous slides we have already derived the expression for specific intensity of black body radiation as B subscript B is equal to 2 h nu cube by c square multiply 1 upon exponential of h nu by kBT minus 1. So now the specific intensity of the radiation coming out from hole is simply IV is equal to BV. So we should keep it in mind that it is only applicable when we have assumed our matter to be in thermodynamic equilibrium. So now from the definition of source function, we know that SV is equal to JV by alpha V, that I emission coefficient divided by absorption coefficient. So from all these equations, we get a famous Kirchhoff's law that I JV is equal to alpha V BV. So now what does this mean actually? So now we know that from the definitions of optically thick and optically thin object, we know that matter absorbs and emits radiations. So it should have spectral lines in the spectrum. Okay. So when we consider an example of optically thin object, so those the emissions that are coming out from him depends upon the absorption coefficient that are the spectral lines. So this is the reason for optically thin objects such as like cloud clusters or like hot gas clouds, we get spectral lines. Now, and if we consider optically thick object, so their specific intensity is directly a function of their source function. So what we can say is like for optically thick object like compressed mass of like hot gases coming out, the radiation that is depends upon the source function from it only. So now why is it so? Like for no supernovas or nebulas we get spectral lines, and for stars we do not. So the one reason we can give is like in stars the temperature varies when we go from its radius. Like if we are in outer surface of the star, so temperature there would be much lower as we go through towards the core of the star. So this is the reason as to why like we get absorption lines in the spectrum of stars. So why is it so? Like for local thermodynamic equilibrium, we need a constant temperature kind of thing. And for that also we know that we have considered our star to be a black body. So why is it so? So in like in previous slides, we have seen like Maxwellian distribution and Saha and Boltzmann equations and Planck's. So for them also the temperature is constant, or especially for Planck's black body radiation, the matter was should react properly with all those things. So why is it so? Like in we have seen the equation of radiative transfer equation. So in that the absorption coefficient has the dimension of inverse of its length. So this gives us the distance between the photons of that could travel between the source and the matter. So like we call it as mean free path. So if we know, like if we keep it as small as that, if the value of that inverse of absorption coefficient is very small, so the temperature would be, we could consider as constant because it won't vary much. Okay. So then we could consider our body to be a black body radiation, and there where comes the local thermodynamic equilibrium, like its function. So like I would like to give you a simple example of it, how it is like if we take a heater, and if we keep a glass shield or a steel shield close to that, so if that distance is very close, so the absorption coefficient is very less. The inverse of that absorption coefficient is very less. So we could consider that the heat that is being absorbed by that steel sheet or whatever is uniform, like the temperature there is uniform. And if we take that far away, so the temperature would vary, like it would go on decreasing till it reaches the sheet. So that is how we consider like like consider how star is a black body radiation and how it follows local thermodynamic equilibrium if we are very close to the star like it to its core. But when we talk about its outer atmosphere or like outer layers, we should we will come up with some other theory. We have to come up with some other theory other than local thermodynamic equilibrium.
in order to guess that. So yeah, this is what was a local thermodynamic equilibrium. Thank you.